In May 1940, an unusual sense of confidence hung in the air inside the Berlin Air Ministry. Behind closed doors there was the rustling of papers, the harsh tone of directives, and the self-assurance of an ideology hardened like steel. And on that day, a report placed on the desk of Reich Marshal Hermann Göring should have poured cold water over that confidence. The words spoken by US President Franklin Roosevelt before Congress were laid out in the document, one by one. Item by item, America must prepare to achieve the capacity to produce at least 50,000 aircraft per year. Göring looked at the sentence with open hostility, then turned to his staff with a harsh, mocking laugh and said, "The Americans seem to believe this propaganda will frighten us. They understand nothing about war production. Let them try converting automobile factories. They will learn that building combat aircraft requires far more than assembly lines." As he spoke, heads around the room nodded as if everyone shared the same conclusion. America was exaggerating, trying to intimidate. Yet within that laughter lay something dangerous, an attempt to smother mathematics with ideology. The Nazi leadership viewed America as a free society and believed it incapable of true mobilization. In their world, power could only be born of coercion. Voluntary cooperation, market flexibility, thousands of companies unified around a single purpose, such ideas lay beyond their imagination. And for that very reason, when Berlin laughed that day, it was in fact laughing at its own future. Because at that very moment, on the far side of the Atlantic, a different kind of silent revolution had already begun in Detroit. The figure written in those documents, 50,000 aircraft, was not merely a number. It was a decision to shatter a nation's definition of impossible. Berlin dismissed it as propaganda. The United States, by contrast, was preparing to turn it into reality with plans, systems, and factories. There was a name Göring did not know, or perhaps did not wish to know: William Knudsen. A Danish immigrant, former president of General Motors, a man who understood the order, rhythm, and mechanics of the automobile industry from the inside out. When Roosevelt placed him in charge of production, Knudsen accepted a symbolic salary, $1 per year. That dollar meant, "I am doing this not for money but for history," and on Knudsen's desk there was no room for romance, only plans, measurements, organization, manpower, and time. In 1939, America had produced only 3,611 military aircraft. The Army Air Corps possessed roughly 1,700 combat aircraft, many of them obsolete, worn out, and short on spare parts. And yet, Roosevelt demanded a 14-fold increase. On paper, it seemed inconceivable. Even America's allies viewed the proposal with skepticism. How will America do this? We'll do it. President Roosevelt's advisor Bernard Baruch answered with a single sentence. First, Bill Knudsen. Second, Bill Knudsen. Third, Bill Knudsen. Knudsen brought the principles of mass automobile production into aircraft manufacturing: division of labor, standardization, repetition, interchangeable parts, quality control, and supply chain management. Aircraft had to cease being handcrafted marvels and become industrial products. And that was the hardest part, changing the mindset. At the time, aircraft production was seen as an elite craft. Few understood it, few could do it. Knudsen wanted to turn it into work that thousands could master. The transformation began immediately. Factories expanded, new production halls were built, hiring accelerated, night shifts multiplied, training centers were established. Not only metal and aluminum were being produced, people were being produced as well. Skill, habit, precision, discipline. By December 1941, America was producing 2,000 military aircraft per month, 20 times more than just 2 years earlier. Göring's laughter was now merging with a distant roar, the sound of presses, rivets, and moving assembly lines. When Ford announced plans for a massive bomber plant at Willow Run in Michigan, it was more than a business headline. It was a collective national decision. We are shifting industry into the rhythm of war. Boeing expanded its facilities in Seattle. Douglas hired tens of thousands of workers. North American Aviation opened new production lines. General Motors entered aircraft engine production. Packard began assembling Rolls-Royce Merlin engines under license. Each step alone was news. Together they formed a phenomenon, the arsenal of democracy. The Nazi leadership's dismissal of America was not merely willful blindness, it was ideological prejudice. They could not believe that a diverse society could unite around a single purpose. In their logic, power could only arise from a single-will dictatorship. Yet paradoxically, America found a unity within diversity. Inside the factories, a shared conviction emerged. We will do this. The German military attaché in Washington, General Friedrich von Boeticher, sent detailed reports to Berlin for years. He saw the potential of America's industrial mobilization. In a telegram sent in December 1940, he warned, "American war production will reach unimaginable heights." But Berlin dismissed these warnings as defeatist exaggeration. Instead of listening, Hitler spoke of America's racial degeneration, describing Americans as half Jewish, half degenerate, and convinced himself they were incapable of sustaining a long war. This ideological blindness was a form of suicide, delayed, but inevitable. Even Luftwaffe intelligence interpreted reports of women entering aircraft factories as a sign of American desperation. They believed totalitarian command would always surpass democratic mobilization. In reality, the opposite was true. Women entering the factories did not signal weakness, but an expansion of strength. It was the transformation of untapped human resources into a new front of the war. When the arsenal of democracy awakens, the world changes. Because democracy does not grow its weapons only within the army. It grows them within society itself. Every new workshop, every training group, every engineer drawing a new line on a blueprint produced an impact more enduring than a single bombing mission. Göring's laughter had faded into a shadow, because what was coming was not merely a flood of aircraft, but a flood of systems. The Willow Run plant became the clearest symbol of American ambition. Beginning on April 18, 1941, this massive complex rose from farmland resembling an entire city, 3.5 million square feet of space and an assembly line stretching 1 mile. The objective appeared simple: mass-produce the B-24 Liberator bomber. But what seemed simple concealed immense complexity. Behind that apparent simplicity lay terrifying complexity. Thousands of components, hundreds of thousands of rivets, wiring systems, hydraulics, gun turrets, and navigation equipment. The Ford's production chief, Charles Sorensen, made a bold promise. While other factories produced 1 B-24 per day, Willow Run would produce 1 B-24 per hour. The claim was so audacious that many dismissed it as publicity, even as pure fantasy. The early results seemed to justify the skeptics. The first bomber, completed in September 1942, had to be rebuilt entirely. Quality control faltered, defect rates climbed. By February 1943, the plant was producing only 56 bombers per month. Critics asked mockingly, will this ever work? But here the true difference of American industry emerged. Failure was not treated as an ending, but as a diagnosis. 4 engineers broke the B-24 down into manageable sub-assemblies and optimized every process. Hydraulic riveting tools were introduced. Prefabricated wiring harnesses were developed. The rhythm of the assembly line was redesigned. Even as production continued, design changes were implemented, hundreds of them, in 1943 alone. By September 1943, monthly output reached 148 bombers. And finally, in April 1944, Willow Run began operating around the clock, producing one B-24 every 63 minutes. This was not merely a statistic, it was a pulse that began to shape the course of history. One aircraft every 63 minutes, a metronome steadily choking the breath of an empire. For the Germans, this was incomprehensible. In their system, everything happened by command. Here, everything happened by mechanism. Willow Run was more than a factory. It was a steel cup demonstrating how democracy could transform industry into a machine of war. Some truths are difficult to convey through reports. They can only be seen in the sky. German pilots first truly felt America's production power during the Tunisian campaign. New aircraft appeared daily. Squadrons grew thicker. Escort formations became stronger. Pilots, once dismissed as amateurs, were now professionals. In December 1942, Major Johannes Steinhoff, commander of JG-77, wrote, "American pilots are no longer amateurs. Most disturbing of all is that there are more of them every day." Within that statement lay something more dangerous than fear, a sense of inevitability. For a pilot, the most crushing realization is not that the enemy is strong, but that he is inexhaustible. The Germans sometimes imagined war as a single decisive blow. America delivered it as a continuous flow. Shoot one down, another appears tomorrow. Destroy two, and within weeks, they are replaced by even more. On January 27, 1943, the first American bombing raid struck Germany itself. As bombers entered German airspace, this ceased to be a localized battle. It became an open declaration of industrial war. In October, during the Schweinfurt Black Thursday raids, Americans suffered heavy losses, but the shock for Germany lay elsewhere. The United States could replace those losses in remarkably short time. Tactics were no longer about momentary success. They were now bound to production schedules. During the big week of February 1944, the 8th and 15th Air Forces launched thousands of sorties against Germany's aircraft industry. The Luftwaffe lost fighters, but the greater loss was experienced pilots. Experience cannot always be manufactured. Yet here again, America held the advantage: training systems, reserve, pools, rotation. As Germany lost its veterans, it seemed to lose its nerve. When General Adolf Galland reported to Göring, the numbers were already a verdict. Germany was losing 1,200 fighters per month, while producing 1,000. America was producing 2,500 per month, while losing only 400. This was the moment when battle turned into mathematical defeat, and that mathematics echoed across the sky like the roar of engines. By 1944, American production had surpassed the very notion of growth. This was scale. In that year alone, 96,270 aircraft were produced, tens of thousands of fighters, bombers, multi-engine aircraft. This single year of production exceeded the total number of aircraft Germany produced over the entire course of the war. The horror of defeat lay not merely in the word "more." The terror was systemic. In 1 year, America surpassed Germany's entire wartime output. The difference was not only numerical. Every American bomber carried overwhelming armament and equipment, powerful gun turrets, complex navigation systems, better radios, standardized maintenance. German fighters, by contrast, sometimes entered combat with partial ammunition, sometimes with non-functioning radios, often short on spare parts. Victory no longer depended on a pilot's courage, but on the braving capacity of the factory behind him. By May 1944, Boeing's second plant in Seattle was producing 16 bombers per day. Douglas Aircraft, which employed just 68 workers in 1936, had grown to 167,000 employees across 9 facilities. North American Aviation was producing 500 P-51 Mustangs per month. Lockheed reached a pace of 1 per 38 Lightning every 90 minutes, while implementing thousands of combat modifications. The supporting industries expanded at the same pace. Engines, aluminum, magnesium, chemicals. This was not the explosion of a single sector, it was the entire economy shifting into the rhythm of war. Every artery toward the front. In this environment, even the meaning of strong tactics changed. When you produce hundreds of aircraft every day, strategy changes with it. Losses are no longer disasters, they become costs. This may sound brutal, but it is the reality of industrial warfare. America accepted this reality and built a system around it. Germany, for a long time, refused to believe it. The numbers of 1944 were not merely statistical reports, they were psychological blows. They whispered the same message to every German commander. Even if you stop, it comes. Even if you strike it, it grows. Even if you burn it, it rebuilds. Nazi ideology viewed women entering factories as a sign of weakness. In their worldview, everything had its rigid place. Men fight, women stay at home, workers obey orders, diversity is danger. But the reality of war shattered these hard molds. In 1941, women were rare in the American aircraft industry. By 1943, their numbers had surged dramatically. More than 300,000 women worked in aircraft factories. They drove rivets, laid wiring, conducted inspections, measured precision. This was not merely a matter of filling labor shortages. It was a transformation that raised production quality. Women's attention to detail, dexterity in fine work, and patience in inspection reduced defect rates. In some facilities, defect percentages dropped sharply. When Ford redesigned tools for smaller hands, efficiency increased unintentionally. Lighter pneumatic tools reduced fatigue. Better planned workstations reduced injuries. Luftwaffe intelligence misread this completely. Some captured reports classified female workers as temporary and predicted a decline in quality. Women's labor was interpreted as desperation. In reality, it revealed one of democracy's greatest strengths: the ability to expand its resource base, to bring everyone into the effort to identity. And it was not only women. African Americans, Mexican Americans, Native Americans, immigrants, the elderly, teenagers. The war factory became a vast laboratory of integration. Nazi ideology judged people by blood. America, for all its contradictions, united people by work. By the time this difference began to show itself on the battlefield, it was already too late, because industry was no longer assembling only metal, it was assembling human capacity. And before that accumulation, ideological arrogance could not stand. As American production surged ever higher, Germany began searching for another way. In February 1944, Göring approved the dispersal of production into underground facilities in an effort to protect it from bombing approved programs designed to achieve this goal. On paper, it seemed clever. Factories would be moved underground, into mountains, into hidden complexes, protected from bombing. Production would continue, but the greatest enemy of plans on paper is reality. In these underground complexes, tens of thousands of prisoners were forced to work under horrific conditions. This workforce was not voluntary, not motivated, and did not believe in the goal. The productivity of slave labor is inherently low, because fear alone cannot sustain quality over time. Such systems also invite sabotage. Prisoners sometimes deliberately damaged components. Quality deteriorated, defect rates rose. Transportation between dispersed sites slowed. Coordination became difficult. Spare parts failed to arrive on time. This became the trap Germany entered in an attempt to save production, because production does not function like a kitchen recipe. It requires culture, discipline, quality standards, motivation, cooperation, coordination. The totalitarian regime tried to impose this culture by force, but within force lies inevitable collapse. America, yes, protected its factories, but its true strength was not concealment. Its strength was regeneration. When one factory was destroyed, another opened. When one production line slowed, another accelerated. This is what industrial depth means. When you lose something, you have layers beneath it ready to replace it. The most striking paradox was this. Although Germany devoted a larger share of its industrial capacity to aircraft production, its output declined. The system was collapsing. Quality control eroded. Training weakened. Labor functioned under fear. America, meanwhile, expanded voluntary cooperation, incentives, training, and standardization. In one set of factories there was silence, the silence of fear. In the other, there was noise, the sound of production. At this stage of the war, the question was no longer who is smarter. The question was who is more sustainable. And sustainability belongs to systems that function without crushing the human being inside them. The day, June 6, 1944, is recorded in history books as a military operation. But behind that day lay a truth too large for the trenches. It was the moment of industrial victory. The air superiority visible on the day of the landings was, in fact, the result of superiority built in factories. During the invasion, the Allies deployed thousands of aircraft. Germany responded with hundreds. This gap reflected not tactical brilliance, but systemic dominance. Preparatory bombing had continued for months. Tons of ordnance had been dropped on German targets. This was not merely the power of bombs, it was the fact that the bombs never stopped. After every mission, squadrons were replenished. Repairs, spare parts, fuel, new crews, logistics had become a weapon in its own right. America's peculiar advantage lay precisely here, the ability to supply two theaters of war simultaneously from across two oceans. It was the defeat of geography by industry. Germany, by contrast, often struggled to supply forces even 500 miles from its own borders. This difference breaks a soldier's spirit, because a soldier knows either this: there are resources behind me, or this: there is exhaustion behind me. When P-51 Mustangs filled the skies, German pilots described them as being everywhere at once. The aircraft was not merely a weapon, it was pressure. The numbers supplied by industry restricted a fighter's choices. There was nowhere left to escape. At this stage of the war, the Luftwaffe might still have been better, but it was no longer sufficient. D-Day proved that great operations are not built on a single day's courage, but on years of production. Without a flood of aircraft, ships, engines, fuel, and spare parts behind it, even the best plan can drown on the beach. But the Allies did not drown, because behind them stood the breath of Willow, Run, Boeing, Douglas, General Motors, Packard, and hundreds of thousands of workers. The historical lesson of that day is simple. Sometimes wars are decided dead not by generals, but by factory foremen. When the war ended, Göring's life became a symbol of a shattered empire. On May 8th, he was arrested in 1945. At first, he remained defiant, comforting himself with the belief that our technology is superior. But then came the interrogations, the documents, the statistical tables, the films. At Nuremberg, when prosecutors presented him with evidence of how America's industrial power, he struggled for words for the first time. Because sometimes the weight of defeat does not come from the sound of artillery, but from the coldness of numbers. He began to confess. I knew America's industrial potential was great, but what actually occurred exceeded my worst fears. Willow Run became an obsession. The damned factory that broke our backs. The idea that a single planta could produce more aircraft than thinking. He had viewed America as a nation of consumer goods. What he failed to understand was that the same mechanism capable of mass-producing consumer goods could mass-produce weapons of war. The system was what mattered. As Göring wrote in his final letter, this war was not won by better soldiers, but by better factories. That sentence did not merely describe Germany's defeat, it marked the end of an era. If a nation can turn diversity into strength, if it can elevate voluntary cooperation above forced obedience, if it can continuously improve production through information and feedback loops, then that nation wins not only wars, but the future. The cruelest irony of this story is this. In 1940, Göring laughed at the idea of producing 50,000 aircraft. America responded by doubling that figure, carrying the burden of the war, supplying armies across 2 oceans, and changing the course of history. The mockery became the most expensive joke in history, paid for with the fate of millions. The lesson remains unchanged for the modern world. Dictatorships often believe their own myths and dismiss democratic societies as weak. But when organization, production culture, and unity awaken within such a society, the outcome becomes inevitable. Factories become front lines, assembly lines become trenches. A rivet can be as decisive as a bullet, and sometimes history's verdict is hidden inside a single number. Those who produce more and better prevail. This story did not end with the sound of guns. It ended in silence, the silence of numbers. As the smoke cleared from the burned cities of Germany, one question remained. Where was this war truly lost? The answer was not in the trenches. It was not in bunkers. It was in assembly lines stretching a mile long. Hermann Göring laughed at the idea that America could produce 50,000 aircraft. That laughter reflected faith in ideology over reality. But history proved that ideology loses to mathematics. Fear cannot build systems. Slavery cannot produce quality. Forced obedience cannot create endurance. By the final months of the war, the Third Reich was no longer fighting, it was exhausted. America chose a different path. It was not perfect, but it adapted. It was not flawless, but it learned quickly from its mistakes. It did not rely on a single miracle weapon. It built thousands of ordinary systems. And when those systems worked together, they became stronger than any miracle. When free people unite around a common purpose, they become unstoppable. Every B-24 that rolled out of Willow Run was more than a bomber. It was an answer to a fatal miscalculation. It was mathematical proof against racial mythology. It showed that democracy is not merely an idea, it is a mechanism. Women driving rivets, young people wiring systems, engineers drawing plans, all confirmed one truth. When a free society faces existential danger, it can turn the impossible into reality. Göring understood this far too late. By the time he stared at the numbers in Nuremberg, everything was already over. History had rendered its verdict. The verdict was simple but merciless. Modern wars are not won on the battlefield, they are won in factories. This story is not confined to the past. It is a warning for those who underestimate democratic societies, for those who believe free people lose their capacity to fight because they choose prosperity. History shows that the question is not intent but system, and when a system is built on freedom, no tyranny can stand against it for long. Göring laughed. America produced, and history has always stood with those who produce.